You don't want my notes.
Good morning. Good morning. This is a joint hearing of the House Ways and Means Committee and the House Education Committee. If folks are looking for documents, you can find them on the Ways and Means Committee page under today's date. We are having a joint hearing today to talk about best practices in education finance and best practices for a foundation formula. We're not here to make decisions. We're here to get clear on what questions we're essentially going to need to answer in the future in order to build an education finance system that works for most. We are together because essentially the policy decisions that the Education Committee makes this year and in the future are going to lay the foundation for the assumptions that will be built into any foundation formula. And so we need to understand the interaction between those things together in order for us each to be doing our work. And so I am very grateful that we have folks from the Education Commission of the states, Joel Moore and Chris Duncombe, to kick us off and give us a very broad overview of how this all works all over the place. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Morning, Courthouse, and thanks everybody for having us. As mentioned, my name is Joel Moore. I'm the Director of State Relations at Education Commission of the States, and also have the pleasure of serving as y'all's liaison to ECS, as well as all your fellow New England states. Before Chris gets started, I know I've worked with several of you before this, but wanted to share a tiny bit about ECS and our work. Education Commission of the States, we're a national, nonpartisan, and non-advocacy education policy center created back in the 60s through the passage of the Interstate Compact for Education. All 50 states, territories, and DC signed on with the goal that states should be collaborating and sharing ideas as y'all work through your challenges and policy solutions specifically related to education. Idea being that we're learning from one another, and no single policy is going to work in every state, but you can learn from one another's experiences and work. So ECS was created to serve as that central clearinghouse. Again, non-advocacy, Chris and I will never tell you what is the best approach for you and your state. You know your state, the context, students, and families the best. But we can tell you what the 49 other states in DC are doing, how they're approaching an issue, and what that looks like for them. We're unique from some other organizations in a couple of ways. We work across the entire education spectrum, from early learning through post-secondary and workforce, and unique in that we are serving all education policymakers in the state, whether it's U.S. legislators, but also governor's offices, departments of ed, state departments of higher ed. Anyone who touches education policy in a state at a state level, we're here to support. So in order to do that, Chris and our amazing policy team are tracking every piece of education-related legislation that comes out of the states, as well as things like executive orders, task forces, initiatives, state-of-the-state addresses, everything that we can get our hands on to inform our work and policy releases. Some of these policy releases that are most useful are our 50-state comparisons, where we'll take a specific issue and dig into a number of data points on that and create a state-by-state database that allows you to look across all the states on a particular policy area. Chris is going to be basing his presentation this morning on our 50-state comparison for K-12 funding. It and all of our other resources are linked online at ecs.org, all free to access for you. Beyond that, some 50 states that may be of interest to you. Do have a 50-state comparison on school facilities construction that Chris also prepared. And as y'all are digging into your work this winter, also a 50-state comparison on state governance and how that is set up around the country. But if there's ever a question that we don't have an immediate policy resource for you, a unique service we have is our information request service. You can reach directly out to me or any member of our policy team, and we will get a written memo response to you back as soon as possible, usually within about 3 or 4 days. So ultimately, I want you to know that we're here as a resource for you because you're super busy and have a lot going on, but we are here to support your work. If there are any questions about ECS generally, I'm happy to take those or pass it off to Chris so that they can get started sharing the meat of the presentation.
Thank you.
Great. Chris.
Great. Well, thank you, Joel, and thank you, members, for inviting us to be here today. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. I was getting some notices about my audio, so I just wanted to check that. Today, we're going to I'm going to start with a national overview of K-12 funding models just to provide some context for the discussion. Then, as the chair mentioned, I'm going to share some of the best practices that states have in the designing of their student-based foundation models that Vermont had previously back before the court ruling in 1997. And then we should have plenty of time for questions based on the length of this presentation. And so hopefully we can really dig into what is top of mind for members of the committees. Joel mentioned that we completed a 50-state comparison in 2024 on K-12 funding models, and this we provide so that if there's a particular area of interest that states want to redesign, they can see how all other 49 states approach that issue. We try to capture many of the key decision points that states have in designing their funding model. So that includes how they allocate aid through their primary funding formula, the base amount, if they guarantee a base per student amount and what that dollar amount is, how they count students for funding purposes. And then we also identify many of the students and unique districts that states provide supplemental resources and how they allocate that aid. We have all of those data points along with state profiles on our website, ecs.org. When it comes to the primary funding model, most states, this question really comes down to how they allocate aid, whether they're doing it on a per student basis. So they're guaranteeing a base level of dollars for every student in the state, or if they're guaranteeing a base level of resources, typically staffing standards that are in state statute. As I'll go through and I do an overview of a map of all 50 states, you'll see that Vermont does not fit into either of these two models. They have a very unique approach to K-12 funding where funding is driven by locally adopted budgets and weighted student counts. In our most recent 50-state comparison, we identified that 35 states and DC have this student-based funding model, with Tennessee being the most recent state to transition. In 2022, they adopted the Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement, or TISA, Act. 9 states take an exclusively a resource-based approach, so being driven by staffing standards and other inputs to running a school successfully. 4 states have a hybrid in which portions of their funding are allocated based on student counts and others based on inputs. These formulas can often be some of the most complex. An example of that is in Massachusetts, their Chapter 70 aid. They multiply enrollment by 10 different weighted enrollment categories and 11 different cost categories. And that leaves 2 states, Wisconsin and Vermont, that have funding models that don't fit into either of those categories and are fairly unique. And you all are familiar with, obviously, Vermont's approach that is different than those 2 models. The trend that we've seen in our tracking of K-12 funding has been towards more centralized, meaning that a larger share of funding is going through that primary funding model as opposed to dispersed across side grants or categorical programs. And they're adopting these student-based models. In the past 5 years, 5 states have made this transition. In 2019, Nevada adopted the pupil-centered funding plan, where they consolidated more than 40 categorical grant programs into one centralized formula. In 2020, Maryland adopted a blueprint for Maryland's future, where they revised many of the formula weights and created a new concentrated poverty weight. I mentioned that Tennessee adopted TISA in 2022, where they transitioned from a resource to a student-based approach. And then just this past year, Mississippi and Colorado both adopted student-based funding models where they shifted more of their funding into that primary funding model. So going into student-based funding models and how those are designed and some best practices. The reason we've seen this transition towards student-based models is because it offers some distinct advantages. The first being transparency. Compared to states with a laundry list of resource inputs, student-based model has a single dollar amount per student and clearly defined weights that determine how much aid gets allocated to districts. This gives district leaders and the public a clearer understanding of how much funds are coming to each district and why. In terms of equity, it is easy to adjust that per student funding based upon unique student characteristics by adjusting the weight. And then finally, for local autonomy and flexibility, districts have greater latitude in how they're using their funds because the state is not specifying that they're using them for very particular programs or staffing positions. Challenges with this funding model is that the state can have less oversight of spending decisions and how districts are distributing their funds among schools within the district. So as part of that, states can increase their reporting requirements as making this change. Both Tennessee and California made that shift, with Tennessee requiring greater school level reporting, and California, when they shifted the local control funding formula, required reporting specifically on how districts are using funds to support certain student groups. To create some clarity of how a student-based foundation formula works, it starts with the base. That's the largest share of state funding. So the state will guarantee a dollar amount that goes to every district, and that will be distributed based on an enrollment or attendance count. The trend has been using towards enrollment rather than attendance, which is what Vermont uses. States may have a fixed base where every student receives the same base amount in every district, or they could have a variable base where that differs based on grade level or district size. If it's varied based on grade level, typically it's a larger base for early years like K through 3 due to smaller class sizes, and high school due to specialized instruction that high schools offer. That base gets multiplied by a weight. This is a multiplier that provides additional funding for certain students with characteristics that may require additional services. An example of how a weight works is if the state has a base amount of $10,000 per student and they have an additional weight of 40% for English learners, they would distribute $14,000 for every English learner and $10,000 for every non-English learner to districts. And then typically, it's not necessary in a student-based foundation, but oftentimes states will have a smaller pot that they allocate directly for state priorities. This can be for improving teacher pay, establishing community schools, supporting early literacy programs. If there is a particular initiative that states want to allocate, they will have that directed. This may be allocated on a per student basis. It may not be. It varies depending on that direct funding program. Now going into more of the best practices, one of the most important decisions that you have in a student-based foundation is what that foundation amount is. And it's important that it is not kind of arbitrarily set, but based upon some measure of adequacy. And states will take a few different approaches to determining what is an adequate amount for funding each student in their state to meet desired academic outcomes. The first is a cost function study. So these are data-driven models that estimate the cost of students to achieve a common desired level of performance. So it is using actual data to link education spending, student need, district characteristics to a specific level of outcomes. The next is a professional judgment panel. And these are estimates based upon panels of experts, oftentimes including educators, other types of practitioners, researchers, that will will generate what types of resources are needed to meet a specific outcome, and then they will cost out what that costs. Evidence-based studies that uses literature reviews for what is needed based upon prior academic studies. And then finally, successful schools models that identify high-performing districts within the state and try to identify what is adequate. You can look within the state or at districts outside of the state. And of course, you can use a combination of these to land at what you think is the appropriate or adequate level of funding. The other decision points is whether to have a variable or fixed base. Most states have a fixed base, and if there is variance, I mentioned the grade level or district size. I discussed the grade level variation in terms of district size. Typically, it's a higher level of funding for smaller districts, which there are many in Vermont. Of course, you can also address that through a weight by having a greater weight for smaller districts rather than having a variable base. The other item that some states do is they build in a mandatory inflationary growth with time. The high levels of inflation we've seen recently, this is an important one, although it can be challenging from a budgetary standpoint. We identified 15 states that mandate regular inflationary growth to the base amount. The most common adjustment is using the consumer price index. Some states will build in some discretionary levels for the legislature to either set that amount themselves or to limit that if it exceeds the budgetary available dollars to fund education that year. The other important decision in designing a student-based foundation are what groups of students to direct additional resources. In our 50-state comparison, we identified that every state and DC provides supplemental funds outside of federal funds for special education. So this is in addition to IDEA dollars. Most states provide additional funding for English learners, the exceptions being Mississippi and Montana. Mississippi adopted a new funding formula, so going forward, they will fund EL students, so that will be 49 states soon. Most states also provide additional funding to support students from low-income backgrounds. And then smaller amounts, but still more than half of states provide additional funding for gifted and talented and small and rural districts. Vermont has funding to support many of these different groups as you provide categorical aid outside of your formula to support special education, small districts, and English learners. And then you have weights within your formula to adjust funding for EL and low-income students. I'll go into the fact that the weights applied to your formula are different than other states with a student-based foundation shortly, but you do have weights for those student groups. So the most common approach for allocating supplemental funds that have a student-based foundation is to use some type of student weight. For special education, that is typically done through multiple weights. So that is, rather than having a single adjustment factor, it's a range of factors. And this is done because students with receiving special education services receive such a diversity of services and placements depending on their IEP that it's hard to have just one adjustment factor. For English learners and students from low-income backgrounds, single weights is more common. But the trend I've seen is to also use multiple weights for both of those student groups. For English learners, that's on a measure of English proficiency. For students from low-income backgrounds, that's based upon either free or reduced or direct certification percentages most frequently. I mentioned that Vermont has weights for EL students and students from low-income backgrounds, but because you have a unique formula, these weights impact the formula differently. So rather than directing additional resources to schools based on the size of the weight, in Vermont, those weights influence the equalized pupil count that factors into the property tax rate. Because of this, the way it functions in Vermont, I would say that weights in other states function more similarly to the categorical aid that you have in Vermont because it's guaranteeing additional dollars are allocated for those student groups. rather than adjusting property tax burden. Many of the new student models have a lot in common. These are the three that most recently made changes to their student-based funding model. So I pulled the information on the base amount and weights just so you had perspective on the variation that exists. Vermont provides a higher level of investment per student. So you'll see that these base amounts are lower than what you all provide in Vermont. But you can see the variation that exists across the different student groups, with some of the states continuing to provide some of their aid outside of the formula through a categorical grant, like special education for Colorado. And there are some additional adjustment factors that are less consistently provided in states. That includes small and sparse districts. Some states provide funding for both of those separately. Some of them only provide funding for small districts or only for sparse districts. When I say sparse, that is looking at the density of students within the district. And then again, less common is providing funding for gifted programs, and a new weight that we've seen some states use is for career and technical education, with Mississippi including that in their formula.
Can I
So
jump in? Chris, can I just ask you a quick question? The decision, you said earlier that some states are weighting the smaller sparse districts, and some states, was that your very second to last slide? Okay.
Yeah, I mentioned that some states may have a variable base, which means that the base amount that gets allocated varies based on the size of the district. So there's not one base amount, rather multiple base amounts depending on what category size you fit in. So that's, at the bottom of the pyramid rather than the middle of the pyramid, whereas other states will have a weight that gets multiplied by the base. And they can have similar impacts. I think the difference with the variable base is that you're then multiplying that base amount by those other weights. So it has outsized impact, downstream. You're multiplying your EL weight or your low income weight by a larger base amount for smaller districts if you have that variable base model.
Thank you. That's helpful context.
And that was really the kind of overview. I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to dig in and answer questions. But I did wanted to provide just kind of the national landscape. Obviously, Vermont has previously had a foundation model, and they found some equity challenges with that approach. I do think that foundation models can be equitable, but they do need to have an adequate base amount and adequately sized weights to meet the learning needs of the students. So thank you all so much for inviting us both to be here.
Thanks, Chris. Do you want to unshare your screen so we can pretend we're making eye contact? Thank you. Representative Holcomb, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I'm interested in your special education weights, and part of that is Vermont's history is that we have found that our reimbursement model has proved extremely expensive and inflationary. But I'm also curious, how do you use special education weights if services are delivered in private settings that are on a reimbursement model as opposed to under district management?
Many states that use those weights will also have a high cost services funding stream that is done on a reimbursement model. So they will provide multiple weights based upon a student's IEP to provide additional funding upfront. If the student has a private placement out of district, oftentimes they'll qualify for that high cost services funding stream that is done on a reimbursement. And usually there's a dollar threshold, or if it's 3 or 4 times the average per student cost, they'll qualify for that high cost services funding, or if it's over $30,000 or $40,000, they'll qualify for the high cost services funding, and then that funding is done on a reimbursement basis. Not all states do that. All states struggle with funding those high cost services, And while there may be a set reimbursement percentage in statute to balance the budget, sometimes those get looked at, which is, challenging for districts, but is a financial reality that state leaders are facing. So that is you're not alone in struggling with the growing costs of high cost services in special education.
I think I may have framed my question incorrectly. I'm actually talking about students who are in private settings within districts in a regular education setting. Is the assumption that if we are waiting for special education, that the funding to those schools would also be weighted by the same weights? How do you manage that?
Well, states can use a variety of approaches for those weights. Some states will have a private versus public placement weight that's different. Otherwise, they'll just base it upon the IEP itself. And that's what the weight will vary by.
I would love to alternate between education and ways and means of it. Go ahead.
I guess I was debating whether this is a dumb question or not. But do states build in some sort of protection so that the political whims don't rob the foundation formula base amounts?
I love that question.
I assume the answer is you can never tie a future legislature, but.
I think the idea is to have a process for determining that base amount and for it to be grounded on a research-based approach that is looking at what are the required inputs rather than just a discretionary allotment. Obviously, it's difficult to guard against that completely going forward, as during the 07-08 recession, many states kind of undermined the adequacy of their foundation formulas by making adjustments and tweaks to those formulas that weren't necessarily grounded on research. That's something that's hard to build against. I would say that having that mandated inflation is one way to make sure that the base amount does not dilute over time. But obviously, with the power of the purse, the legislature has a lot of discretion in their ability to make those changes.
I have a question about how districts factor in infrastructure challenges to these foundation formulas. So in Vermont, we haven't had state aid in many, many years. And so our school buildings are very unequal in terms of how well they've been maintained. And how does that factor in states that might be in a similar situation?
Many states fund their capital construction costs. If Representative, if that's what you're looking at as opposed to maintenance and operations, we'll have a separate funding stream to support their capital costs. And as Joel mentioned, we have a 50-state comparison on the different funding approaches that states take. The funding is, as you alluded to, a bit more sporadic oftentimes when states are providing direct appropriations to districts with spikes during positive economic times when there is money available, and then dips when financially it's more challenging and they're prioritizing operational costs. States will set up grant programs that can be either allocated by formula or by competitive application. In addition to providing appropriations, many states also provide financing support for school districts by either helping to issue debt to finance school projects through the state or through an independent financing authority, or by providing low interest loans to school districts through revolving loan funds, so that the districts can get the funds from the state and pay a lower interest rate than they would be able to get on their own independently. So those are some of the approaches, but we can provide our 50-state comparison that can give you a broader landscape of different approaches that states take to funding capital construction, but it often is running separate from this foundation model that is really focused on operational spending.
This might be a reach because it's asking you probably to crosswalk a couple of your comparisons, but when you look at the shifts lately and the transitions in many states to student-centered formulas, do you have any sense of how that aligns or does not with changes in governance models in states, in shifts in governance models and or even delivery, whether it's the expansion of choice and students following dollars, but kind of a combination of your state comparisons.
That's a great question, Representative. In terms of governance models, I could look into that a little bit more closely. I haven't seen a clear trend in terms of private school choice. While it's a separate policy issue, it often gets combined in the conversation. Tennessee being the example of the state that transitioned to a student-based model and later expanded their educational savings accounts to expand private school choice. So I would say that they get discussed together frequently. They are independent policy decisions. Some states that have this resource-based model have large private school vouchers and ESA programs, West Virginia being an example. And many states with student-based models do not have, broad use of ESAs and vouchers, but they oftentimes are in the same kind of political discussion more so than from a policy standpoint. They could very much be separate conversations. But I think some of the rationale that is used for the transition to student-based models is also used to advocate for expansion of private school choice. And we also have a 50-state comparison on private school funding, choice funding models.
Thanks.
Thank you. Just a question about the local options budget that a lot of states, at least to my knowledge, have implemented as well. So on top of the base where funds can be raised locally, what's your experience with that? And what's your experience with equity in those considerations and also sharing those funds raised on a local budget?
Thank you, Representative. And so you feel free to jump in if I'm missing the mark in my answer here. I mean, I do think Vermont is very unique in their ability to use property tax revenue as a shared resource. Other states, there is a huge barrier that local revenue is driven by what is raised within your district, and that creates large inequity across districts. One of the ways that states with a student-based foundation can protect against that is to ensure that that foundation amount is substantial enough to cover the costs that they want to ensure every state has, and that the weights are appropriately set. A challenge that in states that have a base amount that is too low, you see a wide range of funding where some districts are going well above and beyond that funding amount. And some districts are just meeting it, and you see wide variation in funding across districts. So having that substantial base amount is one element. The second is ensuring that the state is using a cost share approach, that the state is taking on a larger share of the costs in the low wealth communities, and that formula is appropriately set and is not capped. Some states will cap the share of funding that locals will have to take on at, say 80%, so that no locality will have to take on greater than 80%, although they may have the revenue capacity in their district to do so. So by not limiting that share of funding that the state can take on, so the state could take on all of the costs in some districts and none of the costs in other districts, is one way to try to provide equal opportunity for districts using that foundation model.
Okay, and then just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
So if you have a sufficient base amount, the idea is you wouldn't need to raise it locally, right? And I guess the second question is if the base amount is enough, do the school districts all vote on their budgets, or does that become moot in many places?
So in many states that use this foundation model, it's kind of a different flow of information rather than the local decisions informing the state property tax rates. It's the state determines how much aid they're going to provide to local districts using this foundation model, and then the locals will build their budget around how much aid they're getting from the state. So they're still enacting a budget, but they're not impacting how much state aid they're getting.
Yeah, thank you.
How is the voucher amount set? So is it the, so as the foundation with weights? Is that, how, explain?
Those states with a student-based model oftentimes use that base dollar amount as the voucher amount. In states with a resource-based model, they'll calculate an average per pupil state funding and provide that amount. So it's typically kind of the typical level. And generally it is a single dollar amount rather than varied based on local cost of living or revenue capacity.
Can I follow up on that question? So if the base amount is used as a voucher, is that also weighted? Or are the weights only used in public school settings?
I'll have to look at, I didn't do our private school choice 50 state comparison, so I don't want to overgeneralize, but it's my understanding that the weights are just used in the public school allocations of dollars and not with the weights. I do think some states will provide differentiated funding based on different student characteristics. I don't know if those mirror the weights or not, or if those are set independently. So there may be additional funds for special education or students from low-income backgrounds, but I don't believe those typically are identical to the weighted amounts that are in the foundation formula.
Thank you. I have another question that might require long-term follow-up and not expecting to answer now. I'd love to hear a comparison of how states count students in low-income backgrounds. Thank you. Like how, whether it's free and reduced lunch forms or Medicaid enrollments or whatever that is. Thank you. Representative Odie?
I'm gonna wait.
What?
I think I'll wait.
Okay. Yeah.
So the foundation formula talks about how money goes out to schools. Have you done a 50-state comparison or any analysis of how the states actually fund the foundation formula, whether it's property tax or income tax or some combination? And has there been any comparison done about what that has meant in terms of increases or volatility of tax rates in those states?
Thank you, Representative. We don't have a 50-state comparison on local revenue for K-12, but National Center for Education Statistics has some resources, particularly the share that comes specifically from property tax and how that varies by state that I can pass along. I don't know if they get into volatility, but they do have some information on the breakdown of revenues by state.
Anyone from the Education Committee? I'm wondering if, and then anyone from the Ways and Means Committee?
I just have a
Yeah.
brief question. I think it was your last slide. You use the term sparse. Is that what we call rural? Not too many kids out in the country, rural.
Thank you, Doug. Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
and some states will have a broader definition, and so typically it's density. It could also be geographic barriers if there's an island or other geographic things that make it challenging for transportation. States will have can build in that element, but most commonly it's some measure of population density.
Because there's quite a difference in the amount of additional funding they get, 2.5 to 25%. That's a lot of money. Just a comment.
Seeing no other questions, I'm just gonna ask you a closing question. As we engage deeply in this work to possibly transform our education finance system, I am curious if you have just sort of top guiding principles or top questions you think we should be asking ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Representative. And we'll be releasing a resource in March that may be helpful. I don't know if that will be past the time point for these committees that are engaging in this conversation, but we're going to be releasing a K-12 funding toolkit in which we provide 5 guiding principles that you can have in looking to redesign your K-12 funding formula and identifying policy tools within each one of those guiding principles. The first one being transparency and ensuring that there's ample public input into both the design and comment on the final product to make sure that there's both understanding and the opportunity for collaboration in the building of that funding formula. And so I think, you know, as you're in the early stages, that is a great opportunity to really ensure that there's some sort of a process for public engagement. Tennessee is an example in their TISA formula. They had 18 different subcommittees that had opportunity for public input and wide range of stakeholders that were part of participating in those subcommittees, in addition to town hall conversations around the state. And so I think that, you know, if I don't know the speed at which these conversations are going. So sometimes if it's too fast, that can make that logistically challenging. But building in some sort of a public comment period is important for both informing the design and creating clear understanding of what is actually done in the formula. And so I would just raise that up as one item to consider.
Thank you. If there's any way you could share an advance early draft with us, we promise not to tell any other states what you said. Because I think March will be like a moment later than would be entirely helpful. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate all the work that you all do and the time you took with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative. Appreciate being here.
Thank you for having us.
Take care. Folks, we're gonna mute and stay on live for just 5 minutes. So we have like a 3-hour block of testimony today. And so everyone just like quick stretch break, and our next witness will join us in a second. Dr. Sibilia, hello. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello. I appreciate the title upgrade, but I'm just Ms. Sibilia, so
Great.
good to be here with you.
Ms. Sibilia, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. We appreciate your time as we begin our work on education finance, and specifically possibly a foundation formula, are really just looking to understand what are best practices in this work, what are questions we should keep in mind, what are other states doing well or poorly, and diving into that. So appreciate your wisdom today. I think we're going to let you talk for a while. Try not to interrupt you too much because that's hard via Zoom, and then we'd love time for questions at the end.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So let me start by sharing my screen. After many years of testifying remotely, I'm still never sure if I'm doing it right.
I know, it's really hard every time somehow.
Okay, thumbs up, everyone can see it?
Yep, perfect.
Great. So Chairs Kornheiser and Conlin, it's a pleasure to be here, and members of the committee, thank you so much for having me. My name is Rebecca Sibilia, as you heard, not doctor, but pretend to be one on TV every once in a while. I have kind of seen school finance from, I think, almost every kind of circuit. I started my career in school finance as a practicing CFO for what was the State Department of Education in Washington, D.C. I went into advocacy to kind of raise awareness around some of the great and some of the really poor practices around how states were funding schools. Eventually started an organization called EdBuild. In that role, again, we really tried to kind of raise national awareness around issues related to school funding. Left that, moved to the Gates Foundation in order to help shape an investment strategy in state school finance, and have most recently launched a new organization called EdFund. So EdFund is really focused on bridging the gap between what we know in terms of research and what we think in terms of policy in order to support both more actionable policy coming out of the research world and more policy-oriented research driven by policymakers. So I wanted to kind of take a step back and just talk through school funding theory for a minute, because I really think that it helps to frame the conversation of why a lot of states are where they are, and why I think Vermont is also considering and reconsidering the formula. We're kind of in a new wave of what we're thinking about in terms of school finance. And so in the early 1970s, we had two really important court cases. I'm sure everyone's familiar with San Antonio v. Rodriguez. In that Supreme Court case, basically the Supreme Court said that there's no federal right to an education. And as such, the feds kind of had to take a step out of ensuring that states were practicing equitable and adequate school finance. A less notable but equally important court case was Milliken v. Bradley, which was determined in the Supreme Court in 1974. In that court ruling, what the court basically said is that if there's a line that's drawn anywhere for any reason, the federal government can't mandate desegregation across those borders. So what it did is it didn't just kind of lock in schools and the demographic makeup of schools around sometimes arbitrary borders. It also really prohibited our ability to more widely share local resources. Vermont's doing a good and interesting job of doing that, kind of an outlier, but I'll get back to that. As a result of these two Supreme Court cases, advocates really took the issue to the states. The most notable first equity lawsuit was Serrano v. Priest. That was in California. And basically what the courts ruled is that having local property tax driven school funding formulas was inequitable, and the state had a role in making up the difference between local wealth and what was adequate and needed for school districts to operate. Kind of in a backlash against that, residents put Prop 13 on the ballot almost immediately following that court case. What Prop 13 notoriously did in California is it capped property taxes. And so California has kind of been faced with an ongoing problem, even to this day, of adequacy. So even though when you look district to district, the school funding formula is now much more equitable, the state still struggles to get enough money in order to kind of keep up with the changing local tax base as a result.
Mhm.
That kind of happened nationwide. So we saw kind of the replication of the Serrano v. Priest argument throughout many cases in the US. And largely what came out of those court cases, especially when they were ruled in favor of the plaintiff, is you saw this kind of property tax cap. That was really the way that most states addressed how they were going to make up the difference between these inequitable local funding and local wealth bases. We entered then an adequacy phase where, because all of the local revenue was capped and because often states could not keep up with the growing disparities in local wealth, we ended up with significantly underfunded school districts. And so really in the 1990s through, I would say, the early 2010s, we started to litigate whether or not there was enough money in the system. This is particularly important because research got stuck there too. And so one of the things that I often say is that I'm so tired of hearing economists ponder whether or not money matters in schools. This kind of esoteric question that researchers continue to bring to policymakers really just doesn't help in framing what could be smart and more equitable school funding. So what we're hoping to do is move into a new wave phase, both in terms of kind of how we think and how we talk about school finance, into a much more research-driven policy-making strategy. So just to recap, in terms of kind of the equity theory, really began with a focus on equalizing revenue. It's what we call vertical equity. All school districts, all neighborhoods should be at least getting a certain amount of money. That amount of money was kind of targeted regardless of what the student need was. And it led to kind of a capping of the amount of money that was in the system. Recapping the adequacy theory, this was really on whether or not the resources were sufficient enough to actually educate all students in terms of what their funding needs were. There was kind of a effect of lifting all boats coming out of that phase. But obviously it put this kind of restriction on continually having to try to find additional resources, particularly for states who kept their property tax caps in place, which there are still several, although most states have actually loosened those as a result of their adequacy court cases. So the emerging research on weighted student funding, largely Vermont has a weighted student formula with a big notable exception of special education. So we know now, because several states have actually moved to weighted student formulas in recent years, most notably California, we can actually test the effect of what happens with a formula-based, with a foundation-based formula. And what we're finding from both new research coming out of California and also some new research coming out of Tennessee is that when the foundation formula operates in the right way, when resources are actually targeted to students who are low income, ELL, special education in a meaningful way, we see dramatic increases in achievement, and we're actually able to isolate those right now. So in many cases, we see in both California and Tennessee a 0.1 standard deviation increase in test scores. And to put that into perspective, this Money Matters research does show that money matters and it can raise achievement, but the achievement moves are 0.05 of a standard deviation. So what we're actually seeing is that when you have a functional and progressive foundation formula that is weighted, it actually has a more significant achievement increase compared to the kind of just overall question of does money matter, or pouring more money into the system. So just wanted to kind of put Vermont in perspective of what the rest of the country is doing. So as you can tell, you're a resource, or you're a student-based formula. In almost all cases, what we're seeing now is that states are moving to student-based formulas where they used to have resource-based formulas, which was basically a calculation of what the legislature assumed school districts needed in order to operate. In the past 3 years, Colorado, Tennessee, and Mississippi have all moved to weighted student formulas from resource-based formulas, largely driven by some of the research that we're seeing. The states where I've put a star are states where there are active conversations about changing the funding formula. And as you'll note, in all cases, in these states that are kind of heating up, they have resource-based elements to their funding formula. And so it gives us a sense that we're really moving away from the former practice of funding based on a assumed structure of education.
I think you could give us a star on the map.
I will give you a star. I'll find a way to make it a little bit smaller. So how local contributions can affect funding. Obviously, what I like to say about this map is that it's like the dad striped map from the 70s. Basically, every combination of local wealth and local wealth calculation is considered throughout the country. There is no one standard practice. And I think that that's really important as you consider what your local contribution is, how that plays into your formula, and how you're calculating local wealth. The one thing that I will say is that if you think about caps, both in terms of hard caps and soft caps, I would consider Vermont to be a soft cap on property taxes and the local contribution. And that tends to not really be seen anymore. A lot of states are moving away from that. The thing that you don't want to do is move to gray, which is no specific expectation. And I know that that would obviously be such a dramatic change from where you are right now, that that's probably not something that's on the table. If it is, I recommend that you not go in that direction. The one thing that I do want to focus on is how.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt for a second?
Of course.
What does it mean to have no expectation of?
So basically, those are states where they're calculating how much the school district needs based on either a resource-based formula or a student-based formula. They're giving that amount of money. So what the state is basically saying is that we're going to make sure that you are fully funded. And then you can raise whatever you want outside of the formula.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Obviously creates massive inequity, but it assures this kind of adequacy issue. And so where states have really litigated around adequacy, you tend to see those the states where there's kind of no cap or no expectation. Special education. The practice around special education has really started to move to multiple student weights. You can see that I know it's sometimes hard to see with the maps when they're projected, but the majority of states are actually using multiple student weights in order to fund special education. In this case, Vermont is an outlier. Happy to continue to talk about that. One thing that we do see in the research is that when special education is funded using one single weight, there tends to be a capitation effect where school districts will basically undercount the number of special education students that they have because the math tends to just not work out for them in terms of being able to fully fund their special education system. Now, there's an alternate argument as to whether or not multiple student weights create an incentive to over-identify students. And in 2 studies that have been done recently, we don't see that as happening. Again, happy to dive into that. But this is one area where I would recommend the committees really consider taking a look at what's happening elsewhere. Went through a couple of recent reforms. Tennessee was a major reform. They completely overhauled their funding system to go to a weighted student formula in 2022. Several southern states have followed. Mississippi followed this year, or I guess last year. Jeez, they moved so quickly. And they moved from a resource-based to a funding or to a weighted student funding. Alabama will be moving to either a weighted student funding formula or kind of a hybrid weighted student funding formula this year. And Colorado passed a substantial reform where they took a lot of the cost of living and sparsity calculations out of what used to be in the middle of their formula, and they added it to the end as a weight for students so that it didn't become a compounding effect in terms of equity. Again, happy to dive into that more if you're interested. And when you get to the blank screen, that's all I've got for my presentation. Happy to bring those slides back up if you're interested in talking through the practices in several states. But I'm now here and ready to address any questions that you may have.
Wonderful, thank you. Does anyone have any questions? What's happening? Yeah.
So thank you, not doctor. In terms of the local contribution, the expectation, and you said it leads to great inequities and disparities. And we had a previous speaker talking about how states were looking to fully fund the amount of the budget. So there didn't have to be a local contribution, but how often have you found there is a local contribution? And how is that money typically raised? Is it property taxes? Is it bake sales? What is it?
Well, the bake sales we can't see in the data, although in many cases it actually is. There's a lot of money that's raised elsewhere. I'm going to go back and put this map back up on the screen. So what you'll see is that many states use many different measures of what local wealth is. Overwhelmingly, states use property valuations. As you can see, 40 of the 50 states use some measure of local wealth as it relates to property wealth. But there are an increasing number of states that also use an income based calculation. In some cases, they do that as either a credit or a debit against the overall property valuation. So for instance, if you think about school districts in the Rust Belt, in some cases, the property valuation is still high, but the population is kind of leaving the area. And so the property tax burden per capita is actually higher than it would be in other school districts or other areas where there are, a higher number of just households per capita. And so in those cases, there will be a deduction from the expected local contribution based on some sort of income index. There's a bunch of other stuff, like other local receipts. This isn't bake sales, but it is stuff like in Oklahoma, if you happen to sit on an oil well or you happen to have a plane that has the right direction for the wind, school districts get to keep all of the taxes that are raised from those sorts of what I would consider to be industry, that sort of stuff. It really creates some major inequities in Oklahoma, for instance. There are about 35 school districts that are completely off formula because they raise so much money that they're exceeding the amount that is calculated by the state. So the way that, I'm sorry?
No, go ahead. Thank you.
The way that most states do this is a three-step calculation. So they'll calculate how much every school district needs in order to operate. They'll deduct from that whatever they're expecting the locals to raise. And I emphasize expecting because often cases, in many cases, the state is actually under expecting what those school districts actually can and do raise. So there's a lot of money that actually is raised outside of the formula. But they calculate the total need. They'll subtract out the expected local contribution, and then they give the rest of the money from the state. It's obviously a very different mechanism than your current mechanism. Advantages are that there is some flexibility locally, and you tend to see more adequately funded school districts. There's less of a kind of upward pressure on the legislature in states like that. The downside is that there's a lot of money that can be raised outside of that formula. And so it really starts to skew the equity that weighted student formula is intended to create.
Great.
Following up on that question, I think one of the concerns about a possible move to a foundation formula in Vermont is that over time, we would start underfunding at the state level what was sort of mathematically derived. And I'm curious how you see the local option or locally raised funds playing out in terms of putting appropriate political pressure on a General Assembly to maintain state level funding.
I would actually say that it probably varies most often based on the overall tax theory of the legislature. So using Oklahoma as an example here, they capped property taxes. They put a hard cap on property taxes, put the burden on the state to make up this difference. So they still have the calculation minus the local expected contribution equals the amount that the state will give, but they don't allow for districts to raise money outside of that formula. So that expected local contribution is actually the total amount that a local district can raise. That was really great in the 1970s when they moved to that funding formula. But now that the tax theory of the legislature has changed, what we see is a significant underfunding of school districts to a point where the locals are basically begging to come out from under these kind of hard caps because of that adequacy issue. In some other states, the expected local contribution isn't updated often enough to actually adequately capture the overall wealth or what can be taxed by the local district. And so obviously that then leads to runaway school districts where the state is deducting a far lesser amount than they're capable of raising or do raise. And as a result, the state's formula is basically useless. And it's really based on what the locals are willing to put into their system. As you can tell, a capped system puts a lot of upward pressure on the legislature. A uncapped system puts a lot less pressure on the legislature, but skews equity. And so those are
Yeah.
really kind of the tension that I'm sure you're considering right now.
And I'm, despite being sometimes tired of pressure on the legislature, I'm interested in designing a system that does put holistic pressure on the legislature because it does seem to be the path to create the greatest equity in the schools. Thank you. I'm gonna see if someone from education wants to have it.
Go ahead.
And then, anyone from education?
I guess I need a little more clarification because I think what you're talking about, or I'm hearing two different things. One is a local contribution that is deducted from your foundation formula plus weights. So you're still just getting the allocation from the state. And then the issue of here's your allocation from the state, and then you can raise above that using whatever resource you might have. And I guess I'm interested to know how common is that? What mechanism is used to decide that number? I mean, we keep hearing that Vermont is among a tiny bunch of states where people actually vote on their school budget and vote on increasing their school budget.
So I'd actually disagree. The vast majority of formulas that are in place do this calculation. The state calculates, they subtract an expected local contribution, they give the balance, and then locals can raise money outside of it. I can go back and count and get the answer for you. My guess is it's over 35 states that operate in that way, where locals can just raise money outside of the formula, kind of unfettered. And so one of the things that I actually point out to states when I'm testifying is that Vermont actually does have a stronger equity, what I would consider to be kind of like the equity balance of giving locals a little bit of local I don't know, local control, I guess, would be the way maybe you could describe it. But that ends up kind of being capped by the budget. And, you know, obviously the excess that would be raised under a certain millage. The mechanism, though, is the same. And so in states where you can raise money outside of the expected local contribution, what locals are doing is they're just voting on a millage rate or a property tax rate, which operates in basically the same way as approving a budget and then raising the excess taxes for that. Really what they're doing is just approving a budget by approving a tax amount, which then the school district needs to operate within. So what you'll see in most of the states that actually do have this kind of formula is that this school district will put forward to voters every year a levy request, which is basically, can you increase your property taxes by 1 mil, 2 mil, whatever. And they have to justify that by saying what they're going to spend it on. If you think about that mechanism, it's basically the same thing as putting forward a budget and then asking for the revenue to be raised for that. So I actually wouldn't consider Vermont to be significantly different. It's just, how is it calculated? Is it calculated by the district and voted on by the local community? or is the amount of revenue voted on by the local community and the school district needs to live within that. Kind of the same mechanism, slightly different in terms of who has the overall control.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your testimony today. The proposal on the table is one that involves much larger districts and a new portfolio of schools within that, each district that includes a mix of private independent schools and public schools. And one of the things that we've not had to deal with is we've always talked about state formulas that get money to districts, but a new challenge for us is how we get the money from the districts fairly out to the schools. And I wondered if, based on your experience, you could talk about that a little bit and also talk about the implications for a mixed portfolio of schools.
There are, I think, 3 or 4 states, and again, I'm writing a note because I want to get back to you on this. There are 3 or 4 states that have actually put a requirement for weights to flow down to the school level. And so it's a proportion. So if a low-income student is generating, let's say, 25% more money out of their weighted student formula, the expectation is whatever flows out from central costs, the school district that's serving that low-income student will get 25% more of that proportion that's going out to schools. That has been put in place, I know, most notably in Maryland in their recent funding reform. There's a few things that get complicated in this. So one thing is, what do you consider to be a central cost? And so if the legislature isn't being very clear about that, you could have some districts that consider, for instance, transportation to be a central cost, and then they send out, right? So they're going to capture that out of the base amount that they get from the legislature, and they'll have less money to send out to the school for staffing programs, et cetera. In other cases, you may have school districts that consider transportation to be a local cost, and they calculate that based on the number of miles that a school bus runs, for instance. You could do that for nutrition, for school lunches. You could do it for a number of kind of those shared services that can be proportionally allocated to a school, but are oftentimes contracted for centrally by the school district. And so my first recommendation would be, if you're thinking about doing something like that, be very clear about what is considered to be a central cost. Put a chart of accounts in place, a uniform chart of accounts in place, so that every district is spending based on that, and then, review how that's being proportionately allocated. The look at how this is happening in California, where there actually isn't a requirement. California does have a new weighted student formula. There isn't a requirement to allocate resources based on that proportion, but they don't necessarily see a whole lot of fluctuation. So there is an implication that school districts have gotten the message from the legislature that there's an expectation of which students are prioritized. They tend to spend that way. That comes off of a budget, though, that's approved by locals. And so this gets back to your budget question. It's called the Local Control Allocation Plan. It's LCAP. And the locals will approve it every few years, and it's intentionally developed in order for the school district to allocate and make clear how they're going to spend the additional money that comes from special student weights. Problem is, as a former CFO, a budget is just a budget. You pass it, and then when you have cost considerations and cost drivers that you weren't anticipating when you pass that budget, the money gets shuffled around. And so if you don't have back end accountability on that, then you won't see that kind of tight allocation. There are not many states that require funding to be allocated to schools based on that proportion. I don't think that you would see a lot of advocates that would argue against it. I would just caution that it requires a lot of detailed work at the state level in order to make sure that that policy is operating as intended and that equity is equally calculated on a district by district basis through a uniform chart of accounts.
I'm just gonna ask a technical question.
Okay, I have a follow-up
Yeah.
question because I don't think that was answered.
Just in the interest of us having a common vocabulary at this table, would you call that intra-district equity?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and that was the part of the question I was hoping you could address, particularly given your point that different schools and different communities have differential fundraising capabilities. If we are in a, we have a single district, how do you manage intra-district equity? If, for example, some tuition vouchers are paid to independent schools with substantial fundraising capabilities, they can pull down $20 million to build a new center. How do you stay within our constitutional obligation for fundamental equity in the context of this plan, given that delivery choice?
I'm not pausing to run out the clock. But I kind of am, because that's a very difficult question. And I don't think that we have an answer from any state that has deployed a model like that. So what I would tell you is there would probably be, in these much larger districts that you're considering, a requirement of equal share of local taxes that are being raised based on student characteristics. So basically what you're thinking about in terms of proportional allocation, regardless of what's being raised. So you can't have individual school fundraisers, or you can't have individual school philanthropies. We don't see that anywhere. I mean, there are lots of states that have charter schools that are within school district boundaries that can still raise lots of money outside of the system from local philanthropy, and they do. And so I wish I could tell you that there's been a state that's considered doing that. I don't believe there has been. Again, I don't think that it's impossible, but you would be pioneering something that would have to be carefully crafted. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think you just raised lots of other questions.
That's what we're here to do today, is figure out what questions we need to be asking. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Could you explain one more time? Because I still don't quite understand. When you're talking about cities or whatever, I think you specifically talked about Oklahoma spending a lot more. Again, I believe you said that whether it's the base rate or the weighted rate, the amount that the municipality or whatever raised above and beyond that would be subtracted. Is that correct from that base rate?
So there's a expected base rate that's subtracted, and then there's money that's raised outside of the formula. So Tennessee, for instance, in their recent reform, Tennessee hadn't updated their property valuation for about 15 years. And so they were under deducting the huge property value increase that has happened in Nashville over time. So even though Nashville's student needs are substantial, they were subtracting out too little that could be raised in Nashville and giving a lot of excess state funding as a result. And then Nashville was just going and raising more and more and more funding outside of the formula because they had a higher property valuation than what the state was calculating. When they reformed their funding formula, they updated the property valuations, and Nashville was like, whoa, why are we getting so much less money? And it was like, because you've been getting away with a loophole of not updating your local valuation every year. And so the state can keep a tighter hold of equity by making sure that that local expected contribution is calculated every single year and is calculated based on, no like assessment ratio magic that's happening right at the local level and that sort of stuff. Is being actually calculated based on what can be legitimately taxed. You'll have a little bit more control over reining in all of that money that can be raised outside of the formula, especially if you're under expecting what the local contribution will be.
Thank you.
I know it sounds crazy, but that really is how it happens in most states.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. Thank you for that. It's very enlightening. So the expected local contribution is going to vary by to community?
Yes.
And that
So,
money is, yeah.
Connecticut,
And
for
then-
instance,
Yeah.
they calculate what they expect the community can raise from property taxes. That's based on the overall valuation of the assessed value of all of the properties in the school district. They will then deduct or increase what they're expecting those local communities to raise based on the income of the households there. So if there happens to be a lot of vacation homes, for instance, you don't have the locals that are living there paying a much higher tax rate because the overall valuation is really high. And so that's one way that they kind of incorporate creating some flexibility and a little bit more equity when you think about the taxpayer's burden. But the vast majority, again, in 40 states, the base is the property tax base, the overall valuation of the property in those school districts.
So just one quick follow-up. Thank you for that. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is one of the problems with our former foundation formulas, the state didn't belly up to the bar and pay what it needed to do. And so that was when we have a statewide education property tax. So what you're suggesting is that in most other places that education property tax is very local. It's not statewide, correct? Okay.
Correct.
And the bottom as to the amount the state is supposed to contribute based on the formula is coming from a different fund. It's coming from an income tax or some other revenue source. Is that right?
From the state's general fund. Yeah.
Thank you.
Representative Conlon and then Odie, and then we are going to wrap.
Great. So if salaries and benefits are 80% of school costs, how do these states handle pay differentials? Do they have statewide teacher contracts? How does that get worked out?
I feel like every answer I'm giving you makes it sound like it's the Wild West, but it really is out there. I cannot emphasize enough how different Vermont's formula is from the way that most other states operate. So for instance, in Mississippi, school districts can set their own teacher salary schedule. That's pursuant to teacher negotiations, even though they're a right to work state. And the school districts that can raise more money outside of the formula can supplement teacher salaries, and they tend to draw teachers out of the lower wealth districts as a result. And so you see a significant labor market shift depending on the wealth of the community and how much can be raised outside of the formula if you're not updating that expected local contribution often enough.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. So have you seen an instance or instances where the municipal overburden for the taxpayers themselves is recognized? Okay.
No, in fact, I actually think that there's a lot of inequity in the system that isn't being captured when you consider the property tax burden. So for instance, Detroit and Grosse Pointe, the overall valuation of the property wealth in Grosse Pointe is significantly higher than the overall valuation of property in Detroit, but they're raising the same amount of money per student from their local taxes. So what that tells you is in order for Detroit to try to keep up with their neighbor because of salary differentials and the labor market effect, they're taxing themselves at a higher rate. School districts in the Delta in Mississippi are starting to do the same thing. They have very low property valuation, but Arkansas just passed a significant teacher pay raise. And so they're starting to draw teachers over the state lines. And so these very poor districts in the Delta are trying to figure out how to raise more money out of their local revenues in order to keep up with Arkansas. That's not necessarily a problem that Jackson has, because they're in the middle of the state. They can keep their labor market closer. When you start to see kind of some of these border communities where the teacher pay structure is significantly different, you can really have a labor market effect, not just between school districts, but also between competing states and competing wealth bases in those states.
And follow-up, and thinking about the taxpayer themselves, where they live in Detroit, they have sidewalks, they have police, fire, they have a lot of municipal burden.
Yeah.
And then also the schools. Is there anybody taking into account the burden on the taxpayer of those two taxes together? The school tax that's local and the municipal taxes.
I don't know of many. I mean, I think that that's probably a local consideration every year at the city level or at whatever that municipal level is in terms of what the priority is for that municipality. It is inequitable when you consider that there are some areas that are just school districts who have their own taxing authority. So I hear what you're asking about. I don't know of many where there's a actual mechanism that's built into law in order for that consideration to occur in some way. In fact, Washington State is grappling with that right now. We've actually funded a study on what kind of inequity that creates at the local level. So maybe I could come back to you in a couple of months and let you know how bad it is in Washington, who hasn't done that. But unfortunately, I don't have an answer right now because I haven't seen a state that's really codified how that would happen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us and for all your work. Would love to have you back as we get a little bit deeper into the details here.
I am here and this is my job. And so please feel free to call us anytime. And I would love to be back as you consider, as you get closer into the details of your consideration.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Fairly sure I have the titles right for our next witness. Dr. Colby, would you like to join us in the chair? Thank you. The chair. That's the chair in the seat in the front of the room. You want five? We're going to take 5 minutes in order for us to transition and Dr. Colby to get in the Zoom and all the things.
Policy.
My nose might spontaneous.
Okay. We are getting started again. Professor Colby, thank you so much for joining us. I think you've heard the prompt that I gave to the other witnesses, but really appreciate you joining us to talk about essentially what should we be thinking about as we begin this work. And have appreciated the past work that you have offered the General Assembly.
Thank you for having me this morning. For the record, I'm Tammy Colby. I'm a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research. I co-direct the school finance practice and the Center for Economic Evaluation there. I also am the lead technical assistance provider for the federal government's new Center for Fiscal Equity, where I work with states and districts. And I'm the principal investigator for the new national study, $20 million national study of special education finance. So a little bit about me. What I am not today, though, is a state board of education member. I also wear that hat, some of you may know. So anything I say today is in those other roles and that other expertise, not as my role as a state board member. And I understand that some of the things that may come up relate to governance that could be state board issues, and I'm going to just decline to comment on those today. Okay, thanks. So what I'd like to do today, you've heard from some really great people at ECS, and Rebecca, she's great. Here's some really great people today about design considerations, both in terms of what other states do, but also in terms of local formula and some of the big history around school finance reform and equity provisions. What I'd like to do is shift a little bit and really sort of start to think about nuts and bolts, about key design considerations for how you establish foundation formula, right? So we just had a conversation a little bit more directed at the revenue side. I actually want to go back to the foundation formula side now and really start to talk about, like, what are those kind of design considerations? And I'm going to talk about this as design considerations, not recommendations today, because these are choices you have to make, right? So first thing I want to do is I just want to level set how does a foundation formula work? And as I made this slide, I got this big grin on my face thinking this is so much easier to explain than equalize people. This is great. After explaining equalize, and it really is at the heart this straightforward, right? You set a base funding amount, and we'll talk about variable versus fixed basis. You set a base funding amount. You multiply a type of weighted student count, you get a formula funding amount that goes to a district, okay? It really is about that basic. An oversimplified example of how this works is if I had a hypothetical foundation formula where the base funding amount is 10,000, I'm not suggesting it should be, and your weight for an economically disadvantaged student is 0.6, and I had a hypothetical school district of 100 students, and 20% of the students experience poverty, the count would be as straightforward as every student's weighted 1, right? So out of 100 students, I'd create a poverty weighted student count, right? I'd add those together to get a weighted student count, and I'd multiply that by 10,000. Okay. There are lots of permutations on this, but I think sometimes it's just good to, I don't know about you, I like to see the math, right? So that was the easy part. Now let's talk about all the other decisions you might have. And I like to say that state funding formula are like apples. No two are alike. Okay, so we can look at other states and get good ideas. You've heard some really good input from ECS and from Rebecca. But the reality is that if Vermont pursues a foundation formula, it will be unique to Vermont. And so we need to think carefully about some policy design considerations. And I'd like to suggest 5 as a starting point today. And this is more of a framework for thinking about things. 3 have to do with how you design the formula, and 2 have to do with how you might implement the formula. And when I'm thinking about implementation today, I'm thinking about it in the context of the AOE proposal, where there might also be governance changes. So what are the big 5 that I'm going to talk about today? What should be the base funding amount per student? Right? What is that base? And I'll talk a little bit about ways you can set that base. What weights should be incorporated in the formula? What should you weight on? How do you think about setting a weight? How would the weight work? What counts of students should be used to calculate a district's membership for weighting? Already heard some discussion and questions around that. And then on the implementation side, within the context of potential governance changes, how might initial foundation amount be adjusted for efficiencies gained through school district consolidation? And 5, how should funding be allocated to schools within potentially new and larger districts in a Vermont context? So I'm going to work through those 5. So let's first talk about this base funding amount and weights in a foundation formula. So what exactly is it? I think it's really important to sort of get our heads around what this actually means operationalized. It means that you're providing a baseline or a standard funding amount, regardless of other cost factors, that every student has a floor. Now, we sometimes think the word floor makes it feel like a de minimis standard. It doesn't have to be de minimis standard, right? It's just the standard, right? It's just the common dollars that we set for a student. We can set those dollars in a way that provide equal educational opportunities, or we can set those dollars for educational adequacy. What is the difference? Difference is that if we're thinking about equal educational opportunities, we've made a decision that we want to get students to some common outcome, right? And that we're going to ensure that the funding that comes out of this formula is fair and equitable toward that outcome. Adequacy sets the high outcomes oftentimes, and then that dictates how much funding you put in. So one, right, equal educational opportunities is about making sure that we equalize, right, the base. The other design principle is about really directing how much money we put in. The second thing we have to think about with the base is that they need to be cost-based. And you heard about this a little bit in the ECS presentation. I'll talk about the different strategies. But what does it mean to be cost-based? It means that we have to think about what are the resources that need to go into, right, this basic education that we think that all students should have. And what is the dollar value of those resources? A cost-based base needs to be empirically derived, right? And they're usually built from the bottom up or the top down. We'll talk about how that works in a minute. 3, if you have a common base or a semi-common base where you allow it to vary systematically on certain characteristics, right? You can now apply weights on top of that base that generate a proportional amount of additional funding, right? So if I have a $10,000 base and I put a 0.5 weight on it, it means I'm saying that those are $5,000 more for students, right? Regardless of their context. If we have a variable base, then that additional amount of money can vary. But again, we have a stable platform. What we don't have right now in Vermont is a stable platform, right? And so this is a fundamental shift in how we think about, right, sort of what that de minimis standard has to be. It's not locally derived. It's empirically derived through a cost-based approach. And it's standardized across all districts and schools. What are some important design considerations as we start to think about a base? First, we've got to be clear about how we're going to define and measure equal educational opportunity and educational adequacy. What are the outcomes, right? And what are the resources that we need to get to those outcomes? The base funding amount, as I just shared, needs to reflect the cost of the resources. And most studies and most states use some measure of academic performance to help sort of think through, right? Both education, equality and educational opportunities and adequacy. 2, we have to think about what approach or approaches you will use to estimate your base funding amount and your weights. There are 2 general categories, and I'll go into more depth about the methods in these categories. One's input-based, where I assign a dollar value to specific resources that we believe are going to get me certain outcomes. And outcomes-oriented means I start not with the inputs, but I start with the outcomes, and I say, what is the package of resources that I need, that a student needs? 3, I have to think about, should the base vary according to district characteristics? You heard already today, some states vary that, have a variable base. That can be size and sparsity. I think one that was not mentioned today that I do think is relevant here is, for example, in Washington, they're using a variable base that's tied to cost of living, right? So their weights for sparsity, and they have weights for sparsity and size, but their base starts with a cost of living adjustment. And when you do that, when you put the weights on, right, and the weights are proportional, you're automatically building in to each one of those weights a proportional cost of living adjustment. So that's another way to think about that. And 4, another consideration is how will the base amount be adjusted over time to reflect changes in educational costs? We heard that again this morning. For instance, are you gonna have an escalator or an inflation factor defined in statute? Most states do, right? They define this. Or another alternative, well, this can be an and in both, let me be clear. You also can have requirements for recurring cost studies or recalibration in statute. But the risk is that you can't just set a base and leave it, right? You have to be forward thinking, because remember that base reflects the resources to get outcomes, right? And as costs change, that base needs to change. As the technology of schooling changes, right? Or the context of schooling changes, the base has to change. And so it can't be a set it and leave it. We also have the weights, right? And I want to talk about, before I talk about weights, I want to talk, and this has come up in a couple of questions already around what weights are. Weights are to adjust for cost factors that are outside of a district's control. Weights don't adjust for differences in cost due to preferences, okay? So what is a cost factor? Well, we have student need cost factors. Districts very likely can't control who comes to their school on average, right? And maybe you have a special education program, you know that, right? They can't control necessarily that they're in a sparsely populated area, right? Where costs are higher, where they don't have access to resources. They may not be able to control the number of ELL students. So cost factors are outside things that are outside of district's control. When you have, and this came up in a couple of questions, when you have a condition where you are tuitioning out, or you have charter schools, right? We see this, the rate is flat, right? There are no cost factors. So if you're in Vermont and you're paying tuition right now to a school, right? There's no cost factor adjust, your tuition is flat, right? I paid $20,000 for Tammy, I paid $20,000 for Rebecca, right? Doesn't matter, it doesn't vary by my condition, right? So it's the same amount. And that's what we see in lots of other choice states, right? That's how that works. So we have to think about cost factors as adjusting for differences in cost, right? And their costs outside of our control. What should they do, right? Again, it's got to be spending. It shouldn't be preferences. And the cost factors that are already in our formula are student economic disadvantage, English language learner status, student grade level, school size, and population density. We manage our special education, right? Or additional costs for students with disabilities eligible for special education through a categorical grant program outside the formula right now. Weights generate a specific amount of funding, right? So they go on top of a base to generate a certain dollar amount, right? It means that you cannot have a weight without a base, right? And your weight may vary depending on what your base is, right? And so in some places, when you do cost studies, and I'll talk about this in a minute, you will find that on average, your students don't have any needs, but the students who do have needs have really expensive needs, right? And so your base might be low, but your weight might be high. Other places, right? On average, the cost of a student is much higher because on average, the population has more need. And so the differential for a student, such as economic, is much smaller. So those two things have to work together, right? You can't have a weight without a base, and these two things have to reflect the assumptions that are built in the base. 3, weights can be incorporated in different ways in a funding formula. They can be additive, they can be multiplicative. What do I mean by that? I mean, I can weight a student, and then I can put a weight on top of that, right? That weighted student count, or I can say, this is the count, this is the count, this is the count, and add them all together. What that means, though, is that a multiplicative weight has to be calculated differently than an additive weight, Because remember, I'm generating dollars, right? And so if I'm putting weights on top of weights, sometimes those weights are actually smaller, right? Than additive weights, because you have this multiplicative effect. And so the weight, magnitude of the weight can also depend on how it's used in the formula. All this gives us some reasons to be really careful about comparing base amounts and weights used in different states. And that's the first thing I would want to do. I want to see what other states are doing. You pull up the chart, you see, yes, it's got some great resources. Go check out their website, Ed Fund, Rebecca's organization, your previous organization, Ed Build. Their database is spectacular. If you want to see what every state's doing, go to Ed Build's website. Fabulous. It was truly a contribution to the field. So we always want, like, it's interesting, right? We get good ideas, but we have to be careful about comparing dollar amounts and weights. Why? Different states, different costs. Vary in terms of their outcome goals, the government structures, the labor markets, when they last updated their weights, and so on and so forth. 2, states apply weights differently in their formula. Weights, again, can be multiplicative or additive. And unless you know that, right, simply comparing the weight doesn't make sense. 3, I just talked about, there are differences in the relationship between bases and spending, base and spending amount and weights, and that varies by state. And 4, the elephant in the room, politics.
No.
States, you'll never believe, states have negotiated, right? Which are the product of a political process that involves compromise, and they may not be empirically derived. Imagine that. So we have to be we've got to be a little careful with cross-state comparisons. The comparison we cannot make in this state is we cannot compare the existing tax capacity weights to pupil weights. Tax capacity weights are in our current formula, and what they do is they equalize pupils, and pupil weights are foundation weights. We're in Vermont in the future, we're in another state, and they add up pupils in a different way and they're applied to a base. They are apples and oranges, they cannot be compared. Not magnitude at all. So then, how do you determine base funding amount and weights for a foundation formula? And you heard a little bit about this from ECS this morning. I want to unpack this a little more because this, I think, is really important for this group to understand. There are 3 general approaches that are most commonly used in the field now. ECS mentioned the successful school model. Hank Levin used that back in the 90s. It's not used very often anymore. I haven't seen it in a decade or so. The real field is really coalesced around 3 different costing out approaches. Professional judgment panels, which involve convening focus groups of practitioners and experts in the field to propose resource types and quantities for a hypothetical school. It's strength, right? We get field-based knowledge, right? Boots on the ground. What's going on in school? How do things work? What works? What doesn't work? What do my kids need? The limitation is that the input that you get may be limited individual experiences, right? You know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know, right? And it's not necessarily evidence-based, right? 2, evidence-based models, EB, involve compiling published research into model schools. Makes a lot of sense, right? Like, let's look what the research literature says we should be doing, and you push it all together and we say, poof, there's a model school. The strengths, right, means that the cost estimates reflect evidence-based practices. That's a good thing. The limitation is that no school actually exists in this world that has all those things, and we don't know really what happens when you put all that stuff in the school and what efficiencies you get, whether or not it even works, right? And it's difficult to differentiate, right, those costs according to state standards and requirements. This is just evidence in the literature, right? And so it's more general. 3, we have education cost functions. And these statistically model the relationship between student outcomes and spending to figure out a base amount and weights. They're empirically derived. And those weights are calibrated to a base amount. It's not perfect either, right? They don't provide any information on how dollars were spent or should be spent. And that's important to know, right? It also requires good data. Right? Thoughts on it. Right? So a couple things to keep in mind. 1, most high quality cost studies going on in the country right now by reputable consulting firms are using more than one approach. Right? And if you think about it, done well, these things should all line up. Right? When they don't, then you need to ask questions why. Because something's going on. Is it a data problem? Is it an assumption problem? What is it? So most comprehensive sort of evaluation states are using more than one approach. The accepted, more generally accepted combo is evidence-based and professional judgment together. And Pikus and Ahn Associates did that in the 2016 report for you all. My understanding is that they did not do both in the update.
No,
My
they did not.
understanding is that the update, from my read of it, I say my understanding because I have not spoken with Larry. So my assumption is only based on the public report, is that they update only the evidence-based side of that, not the professional judgment part. But I do want to say that their 2017 report, 2016 report, used both. Okay. We use both APA, who you also heard from, used both in the Colorado study recently. Other recent
Sorry, I
studies.
just want to, what feels like months ago was weeks ago.
Yeah.
We heard testimony in this building, but maybe in the other room.
Sure.
About the fact that Colorado had recently done this and they had used two different firms to model. We went around in a circle with scheduling and realized that those two firms were the firm that is working with the Agency of Education right now, and we've heard from APA, and AIR, where Professor Colby is. So I know that I said we were going to have in that other firm. That is not entirely the capacity that Professor Colby is here in, but it is a very small field.
It is a very small field.
Okay.
And I did not lead the Colorado study. I'm a little busy with a few others. Drew Atchison led that study, and Bruce Baker did the modeling. And those two names will come up in another moment. I do have all the Colorado results right here for you from our study and from the AP study. But in several of the studies that we've done recently, for example, in Delaware, we use both approaches, both PJPs and evidence-based, education cost functions. It is not unusual to use both. But the combos that we usually see are evidence-based professional judgment paired together and an education cost function and a PJP. So you get the what and the how. And it's important to know that done well, there's growing evidence to show that at least on the PJP and the cost function, that those two things line up pretty well. And that's new since I talked to you all about our study a few years ago. So a few years ago, feels like a lifetime, when I was a professor at University of Vermont, and I worked with AIR as a consultant to the study of UVM. We conducted the Vermont study of people weighting factors. And our job in that study was not to calculate a base. It was to think about whether or not the weights in the current funding formula, whether or not those equalized pupil weights needed to be adjusted. But the way that you do that actually looks pretty similar to the way that you do weights for a foundation group, right? Both approaches, right? You start with identifying your cost factors. Empirically, right? You identify your need factors that have the strongest predictive validity for differences in student outcomes and aspects of school context. That's your first step. Second step is you estimate a spending amount for an average student with no additional needs, dollar adjustments to the piece, right? For identified factors. Where our study parted ways is instead of creating a base and a foundation weight, which is typically what we do in all the other 36 states, we pivoted and we created equalized pupil weights.
Because that's what we asked you to do.
Because that's the formula. So we had to do that. But I say this because it means that under the hood of our study, we actually had the data to calculate the base and weights. So we did that. We took the base funding amount, pupil weights from Vermont's ECF, and we project that, and our data for that study goes through 2018. We use statistical procedures to project forward with a linear time trend, which of course should be updated for more recent data. We assumed that the weights were additive, right? Which is the simplest way to do this as a starting point. But remember, weights can change if you make decisions. So additive means, for example, a secondary student experiencing economic disadvantage would equal 2 weighted pupils because they'd be 1 because they're just the person. They get 0.75 because they're economically disadvantaged. They get 0.25 because they're secondary. So they count as 2. That's how this works. I also did a different study for y'all that I shared with you last year for 2024, where I actually used professional judgment panel to cost out ELL weights according to according to language proficiency, WIDA, with the language proficiency level. And this was something we wanted to do in the study of pupil weights, but the data, there just aren't enough observations to do that, right? And so I worked with professionals around Vermont to come up with cost estimates by language proficiency level. So what you see here is the weight for ELL that comes out of which would be sort of a homogeneous weight, right, for everybody. And then I have the weights that I took from the other study and compared to the base and created weights by WIDA levels. So what do we have? Our estimate based on the 2018 data is that the base funding amount is $15,500 per pupil. That would be a base.
Can I ask a question? So
Yes.
you're saying it's based on the 2018 study that you did. Have you inflated it to 2020?
Yes, so we did a linear time, right? So we have all the data for 2018. And we took those data and we did a linear time trend, right? That projected forward to the 24-25 school year. And you'll see that there was a little note here that says the projected base funding amount and corresponding weight should be confirmed by incorporating the gap years in data, right? Because it's a time trend. And so if somehow that wasn't linear and we had COVID in there, remember that whole thing? That can make for funny time trends, right? So we should do that, right? We don't have that data, but if someone wants to provide the data, we can put it in and crank them out. No, models are all set up. And I do want to acknowledge that Bruce Baker pulled a few late nights to do this. And if you all aren't familiar with Bruce, he is one of the best minds in school finance, and he did this work for us on this just out of his own goodwill, because he is a 1983 grad of Rutland High School. So the base that you see here is taking the data through 2018 and projecting forward to the 24-25 school year. And the base amount is $15,500 per year. The economic disadvantage weight is 1.75. The overall ELO would be 2.33. We have a secondary weight of 1.25, and then we have the school enrollment rates. And then you can see over here, the weights for ELL would be for level 1, which is most intensive language unit, be 2.16. Same thing for levels 2 and 3. Goes down for level 4, goes way down for level 5 and 6, which is 1.11. And we also have a weight for SLIFE, which are students with limited or interrupted formal education. The weights for the levels 1 through 6 are mutually exclusive, right? The SLIFE weight is also mutually exclusive. So you could be level 1 and SLIFE. And I would encourage you to talk with our Agency of Education colleagues about what SLIFE is and what that means. But students are not designated as SLIFE forever, right? This is usually recent immigrants and the fact that they need additional very intensive services that are over and above what we would expect just someone who's learning a new language.
So just for an example, because the word SLIFE is, well, it's not a word. Someone who was born in a refugee camp and was, sort of in that situation for many years. Is that what we're talking about?
That's right.
Thank you.
That's
Great.
right.
Okay.
And SLIFE has been recognized in other studies with EL that have looked at EL populations, notably most recently in this Nevada study, which was done by WestEd with APA. So it's not an unusual thing to do. And you heard, I think, from APA, and you also heard today from ECS saying the idea of creating leveled weights for ELL is both a something states aren't doing, but something that states probably should do. And you can see why, right? Like that high level weight masks a lot of variation in here. And that was always a question that came up with the Vermont when we had the weighting study before. It's like, gosh, that weight feels high, right? And it feels high because we have a larger number of kids, right, that are in levels 1 and 2. But as kids progress out, right, that weight should go down, right? Because the level of need that they need. So we updated the base and we updated the weights based on, again, the data through 2018 and this linear progression. There are some other things to consider here, though, okay? What we did is we took our existing models. There could be some additional things to consider, and these things will be particularly important to consider if there are sort of shifts in governance towards consolidation. One, the special education weight. You heard Rebecca already talk about multiple weights. We currently have a census-based model that actually came out of a study that I did in I don't know, I'm getting old, I don't remember all the dates. Long time ago in a land far, far away. And that census-based block grant was intended to give districts more flexibility, right, for early and intervening services. It also was a way of sort of capping rising spending because the studies showed that the reimbursement model had unintended consequences for spending. Most states do use multiple weights, and we are working on multiple weights in multiple states and studies that I'm working on, and also the federal government. One of the reasons to think about a multiple weighting system is because just like what you just saw here in ELL, think about all the different kinds of disabilities you have. And that's a critique of the census-based funding formula. And so thinking about that particularly, and I'll come back to this when we get to inter-district funding, particularly if we go to larger districts where we're thinking about now intra-district allocation. We know, for example, in Chicago, they try to use an intra-district allocation for census-based funding formula, and that was really problematic, right? If you just give a block grant out to schools can't raise more money, right? And it didn't work very well. So that's one thing to think about. The second thing is we already talked about cost of living adjustments. Third thing is concentration factors, and you heard ECS mention this today, right? There are efforts to incorporate concentration factors, particularly for student economic disadvantage, where we recognize that as a whole, after you get to a tipping point in a school with a certain share of students who experience economic advantage, or maybe even ELL, right? That the structure of schooling in that building is really different, and it costs more, and it's bigger, right, than just the individual student weights. And so in some places, in some states where they have places in there, where they have places where there's a lot of concentration, and then places where they aren't, they're actually starting to think about concentration weights, and this is something that's come out in the work in Colorado.
Can we talk for just one moment about a little bit deeper about the pros and cons of using a weight versus a grant for special education, like special education, for example, let's just go a little bit deeper. Our current census-based grant. So the strengths of a census-based approach are that if it's a block grant, right, it allows for flexibility in spending, and particularly for early intervening services. And the logic model behind that in Vermont was at the time, and I think still is a priority by the agency, is that we really want to promote early intervening services, multi-tier systems of support. And what we had under the reimbursement system was a circumstance where to get additional dollars, you had to put a child on an IEP, right? And so it was really difficult for districts to manage that. And so that is the strength of that model. It's also very predictable and transparent, both for state policymakers and budgeting, right? And it's also predictable and transparent for districts. What census block grants do not do well is adjust for differences in student need, right? It's the average. Now, in Vermont, we have our high cost reimbursement program, right? And that's for extraordinary costs. Some of the data that I've been seeing recently come out of the agency suggests that we have an extraordinary number of students qualifying for extraordinary cost aid. To me, that's like a flashing, right? I've got a flashing light in my head as someone who does special education research, because that tells me that something in the system is not working. I'll just be honest, because that's really supposed to be your insurance policy escape valve for districts when they have that child with such extraordinary needs, right? It's going to break the entire budget, right? And so if we're seeing costs in that category go up so fast, it could be one of three things that are going on. You just get more kids, right? It could be you're getting the same number of kids and they just have higher costs. There would be some combination of the two. And I think we got to understand it, right? And is that an unintended consequence of having a fixed grant amount for the census block grant? So districts now are looking for other ways to backfill on the average? Maybe. Weighted student funding formula, like multiple weights. The advantage is that you can be more precise with your cost adjustment. But here's the crux of the issue.
The crux of the issue is that we as a field are still working on a better way to think about like, what should the categories be? Disability category is a very bad proxy for student cost. In fact, you can see in the National Special Education Spending Study that there will be high need students in your specific learning disability category who have about the same cost as a low need student with autism spectrum disorder. So disability category doesn't work. It also creates there's also nascent evidence that actually creates incentives to identify kids for certain categories and label. We don't want that either. So the field is moving toward more need-based categories that are based on groups of disabilities. Florida now has a matrix that they're using where they actually look at need. One of the goals of the national study is to really dig in need. But if you go to multiple weights, one of the things is you got to figure out what you're weighting on. And that's a little tricky, right? It's a little tricky. Long answer to short question. Did I get it?
It was perfect, thank you.
Great.
Okay, do a follow on or do you want us to wait?
I'd love to wait, even though I
Okay.
didn't wait. I'm so
Okay.
sorry.
Okay.
Look, now we're talking about weight.
Okay. The other thing we did, right? So we're moving down our list, right? Of things. Now we got to figure out how we're going to count students, right? That's kind of a big deal. Our foundation formulas calculations, you basically need two counts by district. Your total kids and the kids with specific need characteristics on what you're going to weight, right? Got to have those two counts. Yeah, if it was only that easy. Right? Well, how do you count a kid? Vermont's current a design consideration is, will the new formula continue to use the same approach for counting unrelated students? And what we do is we use an average 2-year enrollment for the previous 2 years, right? And enrollment is the number of kids on October 1. A pupil is 1, whether or not the pupil is enrolled full or part-time. Some things that we need to think about in Vermont. How does this work with declining enrollments? Right, so for example, in Colorado, one of the things that's being considered is a 3-year average. I've seen 5-year averages, right? Like, we have to think about, like, what does that mean? Because if we start to have cliffs, then school, remember that when we have a base funding amount and the weight, we add all the kids up together, like, part of that, not all those dollars educate just the kids. Some of those dollars pay for the lights and the heat, right? And so we can end up cannibalizing, right? Those things that are foundation to keeping a school open. And so big fluctuate, like if you had a huge drop, you can end up with not having enough money to operate a school. Oh gosh. So we have to think about that. The second thing is, will enrollment include students attending public pre-K at a school or district? There's a proposal on the table that says yes, but it is a design consideration. Currently in Act 127, we don't count them as a full student. We count them as 0.46.
And naming, that was an absence of a decision that we made.
That was an absence of a decision.
Okay, so we're just carrying forward. an
Carrying
absence of
forward,
decision.
and thank you for clarifying that. And also there's been a study that came out since then that's doing some cost work around that. But I think I'm framing this as a question because I think it's a question that we need to address. 3, how will students who attend early college or career and technical education be considered in a district's count? When we did the Vermont pupil weighting study, we did a lot of interviews with districts around this. One of the things we heard, and I've heard in other conversations since, is that when small school districts lose a large share of juniors and seniors to early college, right? That really messes with their total dollars, but they still have responsibilities for those kids, right? Those kids still do sports, they do advising, right? So that's something we need to think about. Same thing with CTE. And some states are, as you saw this morning, are thinking about a weight for CTE, which implies that the cost of CTE is over and above. Other places you can think about funding CTE and having a separate base amount, right? What might it look like if you had a base funding amount for a CTE student and then adjust that for need? You also could do that and have a variable base, right? Where you have a variable base for CTE students, and then you say a CTE student and a weight on top of that, right? I think but this gets into the counts, right? And we have to think those through. Again, these are design considerations, not recommendations. The last 2 things I want to shift now to are a couple of things to think about with implementation, particularly with respect to the AOE's recent proposal. And I should say that I have no insider information other than what's up on the web about their proposal. Okay, so this reflects what I've read, but I don't know all the details and I can't speak to them. But if in fact, the policy direction is to consolidate schools and districts on some large scale, there are a couple things we have to think about, right? We've got to think about what cost-based estimates we have to think about cost-based estimates for gains in efficiency. What does that mean? So right now, it costs X, $15,500 per student, and we wait. You want to take sort of those preliminary numbers. That's what it costs right now. Let's say we smushed everybody together into 5 school districts next year. That 15,000, there would be efficiencies gained probably in year 1, probably different efficiencies in year 2, probably different efficiencies in year 3. The way that we think about this is you have to name what are the efficiencies you intend to gain in year 1, and what is the cost of those efficiencies, year 2, year 3.
When you say the cost of those efficiencies, do you mean, how would you apply the cost of the efficiencies?
So if you're going to centralize transportation, right? You have your transportation now, you have your transportation this, the cost of the efficiency would be the difference between the two. And you would expect, right? And my 15,500 over time, that number should come down, right? Because we've gained that efficiency. Some efficiencies will happen right away. Some efficiencies, and we've seen this with the centralization of special education in this state, it's taken some time. And so we need to make realistic assumptions about what efficiencies do we think we're going to get, when are they going to come, and we need to cost them out from a resource-based perspective. I mean, resource cost modeling is the gold standard in the field. And again, that is naming the resources. How many man hours, how many buses, right? Who's going to do the work? What does it look like now? And what does it look like then? And then that's your difference. That over time, you can apply to a per pupil amount and you can calculate it. And then the second part of this is a phased-in approach, right? Where you have a clear timeline for not just implementation of a consolidation, you have to have a clear timeline for when you expect what share of those efficiencies to come online. They're not all going to happen in year 1. Efficiency gains will not happen overnight. And the risk is, if we assume an initial base that reflects what could be, we will end up penalizing schools and hurting kids because they will not have enough money to operate. So if the goal is to gain efficiencies through consolidation, and I think our study has shown that it's higher, that there are higher costs with operating small schools, right? There probably are efficiencies to be gained consolidation. But if we're going to do this kind of work and have a foundation formula going at the same time, we've got to name the efficiencies, cost them out, and map them out over time so that we have a stepped-in, phased-in approach to reduce it systematically and transparently reducing the base over time. And then we need to check in on that over time, right? Like doing that, actually penalizing schools and they don't have enough money. And then they can't provide substantial equal educational opportunities. And then that's a bad thing for kids. The courts don't like either. The last thing I want to talk about is for design consideration. Again, there's probably a lot more, but these were 5 I thought we'd do today. The magic number 5, all in one hand, is allocating funding to schools within districts. And you heard Rebecca talk a little bit about this, but this is a really important consideration, right? And large districts need equitable ways of allocating resources and funding to schools. If we go to 5 districts, right? And let's hypothetically say the amount's 15,500 for, we do all that stuff and all that dollars go out to the districts, but then they've got all these schools. How do we ensure that the dollars that go, even though we've done all this equity work at the district level, how do we make sure that we don't end up with intra-district inequities? And this has been a challenge in large districts. For example, in Maryland, where we have districts contiguous with counties, same thing in Florida, LA Unified, Seattle, Boston, New Orleans. This isn't new news, right? Chicago, large districts deal with this. And so we need to think ahead about how it is we manage that challenge, right? Schools within the district are going to have different populations with different needs and different contexts. It will be that some schools and some districts will still be small and sparse. It is highly unlikely with our geography that all small schools are going to go away. School spending is going to depend on the extent to which districts provide common services. Maybe District A decides to centralize everything. Well, then what goes out to schools will be smaller, right? Maybe they don't. We have to figure, right? So you've got to figure out what's that share going to be of the dollars that all go to the districts, how much stay in the district, how much go out to schools. We have to remember the school funding, right? So that's not like what we have now, where, oops, we don't have enough money, we go out and do something, right? We raise our taxes next year. They can't do that anymore. It's all at the district level. And so we have to, right? We got to make sure that the dollars going out to them are going to be adequate and appropriate to needs. And if there's choice within districts, there has to be a common dollar amount that follows the child from one school to the other. And that's how it's done with charter schools and others, right? And then again, we need to define what is central or school.
I'm sorry, Kate, so you're saying that the same amount would go to a public school as would go to a private school?
I didn't say that. I was being careful to stay out of those waters. I think if you have intra-district choice, and I don't see anything in the proposal that says we wouldn't, and I don't see anything in the proposal that says we would, and if we had intra-district choice, I don't know how that would operate with public independent schools and religious schools that are approved. That said, what I can say is that within large districts, like Hartford, where we have magnet schools, right? We have to think about how dollars follow students, right? And that's part of this equation of dollars coming from the district down to the schools. Typically, when dollars follow students, it's a fixed amount that follows the student. And you heard that from her as well.
And is that true? Is that true for special education as well?
Yeah. Yes and no. So it depends on the district. So we have to make choices. If we go to mega school districts, we're going to have to make choices about special education delivery. And there are different choices that districts make. So I talked about Chicago. I did a lot of work with Chicago. And Chicago's played around with this a number of different ways, and they failed miserably a couple times. And one of the things that's really hard to figure out is what resources are at the school level and what resources at the district level. So there could be a world in which in Vermont, we have a school district where we say special education is all district responsibility. They send out itinerant teachers, all related service, everything's at the district level. Well, then if there's a student with an IEP who goes to a school that was within intra-district choice, regardless of its designation, try and stay out of those waters, right? Then the district is still on the hook for providing services, and we don't have dollars on students. If you have a situation, right, where we have some at the school and some at the district, right, then what is the expectation for service provision at the school level, right? And if you have different types of schools, what are the assumptions about the service provision at this school, right? Services will be over at this school, services will be at this school. And then you have to talk about okay, how am I allocating resources? If the district's not providing it, how am I allocating resources to both those schools? And so typically this is a dollars follow student model. Again, it gets messy. And you heard Rebecca talk about that being messy too. There is not a good way, not been figured out.
I just want to clarify some language. You described mega districts.
Mega district.
I just want to, clarify maybe that even the 5 district proposal, they're still fairly small districts as compared to other states.
Yes.
Okay.
I was thinking mega districts like LA Unified and Chicago, and
you're not saying these proposed districts are mega districts.
I do not know enough about what is being proposed to be able to comment on the governance structure that's being proposed.
I'm just saying the total population of students in the entire state of Vermont
is less than LA Unified.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm talking in really big school districts because that's where most of this is occurring,
Great.
right? And what I'm taking is from those places, right? lessons that have been learned that when we have districts with lots of schools, so how about we move from population to just having a lot of schools,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right, same issue, right? And so that's on, I do not have enough information to comment on the consolidation.
Me either.
So, with that, so we have these challenges that we have to think about, and I've thrown a bunch of them on the table, right? But historically, when we've talked about intra-district funding, districts have funded using uniform staffing formulas like staff ratios, right? Child and, class size, things along those lines, other kinds of staffing ratios for related services providers, or they allocate by programs. And this approach assumes that all schools need about the same level of funding or resources per student. Okay. The emerging best practice is a weighted student funding formula within districts, right? Which, like a state formula, uses pupil and other cost factors to allocate funding equitably. The weighted student funding formula, we still have decisions, which is how much of the dollars the district have go out to the district that got to the schools using the formula, right? You have to think about what cost factors are you going to weight? We already talked about some of the special education. Like, it's not, there are more considerations that we have to think about when we go that way, but I just want to signal that that is the emerging best practice.
Representative Brady, did you have something?
No, keep going.
Okay, well, I'm gonna wrap up. I just want to acknowledge the members of the research team, and that's Drew Atchison at AR, Bruce Baker, Rutland 83, and Jesse Levin, Dr. Jesse Levin. So great team and great colleagues in this work. So let me stop there.
And you have an appendix?
I do have an appendix. Thank
I
you.
just want to make sure people see it.
Yep, I tried to provide this comparison across costing approaches in terms of what the approaches, strengths and limitations, and some examples of state studies. Only because I know that in Vermont, we've had different methods used, but I do really want the takeaway to be that these are all reputable approaches to doing it. They have strengths and weaknesses, and that really best practice is in a state to use more than one. In Vermont, you essentially have, you've got the pupil weighting study, you've got the other study that's been done by PICUS and now updated by APA. But what we've seen in other places is that those numbers really should triangulate. Now I'm back.
Representative Brady. I'm going to try to figure out how to frame this as a question, but it's the intra-district dynamic that I think has become more concerning to House Education Committee in the last week, as you think of some of the implications. So is there anything in the way you develop a foundation formula that helps prevent a scenario in which, say you have a 34,000 kid district in Northwest Vermont suddenly, so that you don't end up with, let's say, just public choice, taking the whole private school choice thing aside for now. Like, my kid's really good at football, so they've got to go to this school. My kid's on the AP track, or they have IB, so they've got to go to this school. So that you end up with kind of de facto sorting and school, sorting within because of, sort of parents' means to navigate a system, and not necessarily just based on geography and transportation, even just within the public realm of schools.
Yeah. So 2 reflections on that. 1, choice is only choice if you can choose.
Exactly.
Right. And so when you have district choice, there will be people who can exercise that choice and there will be people who can't. Right? If you don't have transportation and transportation isn't provided, then it's a false choice. It could be a false choice. Second, advocates of intra-district choice advocate that sorting is a good thing because it allows parents and students to better align education with their individual preferences. On the flip side, folks who are concerned about choice raise questions about equity and whether or not sorting ends up in other kinds of ways to stratify according to race, socioeconomic status, and other things that we care about. So all of those things are in play. What we know is most recently in the Chef case, which is the school desegregation case in Connecticut, intra-district choice was actually mandated by the courts as the preferred method. There's evaluations that have gone on over this. It suggests that it didn't work very well as a desegregation tool because not everybody could choose and there was a lot of sorting that went on and that kids didn't ride 2.5 hours on a bus. Right? So those are all things that are in play in that decision. I think the general trend is that if choice is on the table, then those are going to be some intended and unintended consequences depending on which side of the fence you're on. And you can't really have choice unless you know that you're going to have both people, that's going to happen, right? And again, some people will argue that's a pro, some people are going to argue that's a con. But that's what choice does, right? Because that's the economic model of lining up preferences, right, with the preferences for education.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Colby. Your couple of thoughts. One, you started by saying you weren't going to make recommendations, and I respect that given what you're doing.
Trying.
But I'd also point out, at least for having gone through this testimony with you, what you outlined is very sophisticated stuff. It's not simple stuff.
No.
And the people in this room and others outside basically have an obligation, if we're gonna go forward with anything at all, is to come up with something that's coherent, sensible, makes sense. You get all those terms. So I'm gonna say two things. One, even if you're not making recommendations, it would be nice to have recommendations. If you could kind of slide into it, or however works for your professional sensibilities, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure exactly where this little thing goes right now with me, but we will have to do our work to kind of parse what you say, and it'll take me a day at least to print out your slides, make notes on them, and try to figure out the answers that the questions that I think would be most helpful if we could bring things down to a manageable size, I guess. So I guess what I'm sort of saying out loud, appreciate you being here. Appreciate very much the limitations of your abilities within this context and group and stuff like that. But I guess I'm looking for help from people around the room and what to help to try to define explicitly as we can what questions we need to answer to go forward. And it's not an overnight discussion, but so thank you, and we'll see where we end up there.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to contribute. I would think that taking the 5 areas and questions and breaking that down with the next layer of questions, if that was what came out of today's talk, I'll do Laughs Drive the Building of Joy, right? Because I think that was my goal, which was to lay out, here are the things you need to think about, and now you need to think about them. There are lots of people in the field who are really smart about pieces of this, and they will willingly come and talk to you and help you think through things. I'm going to go back to my other slide though, which is this is apples, right? Like there's no one way to do this. Okay. And so some of this is going to have to be Vermont specific, and there'll be some politics involved. It's true, the elephant's over there in the corner. But what I do hope that you walk away from this are 2 things. One, this is not a 2-page policy proposal. There's a lot of thinking that has to be done to do this well. And we need to ask careful questions, and we need to have good data and evidence to make decisions. The second thing is that that's doable. This is right. You've heard a lot of stuff from experts today. I'm sure it feels, this thing over there, wow, this is like a master class in school planning. Like this is a lot of information to take in. I know that I would feel that way too. So I think breaking it down into small chunks and starting to ask those questions and work through them is a good way to do that. But know that there's people out there who are willing to support, ECS, like there are people who, this is what they do. They help states. There's a comprehensive center, U.S. Department of Education. And those folks provide objective data analysis. They'll tell you pros and cons, right? And I think that could be really helpful to your process.
actually, I sort of hate to ask a question that's more in the weeds, given that summation. But it's been suggested that we need a transition period from sort of what we have now to the foundation formula. And it's been suggested that, let's say you sort of were able to calculate your efficiencies 5 years out. We need to get from here to there.
Yep.
And one model was the same one that was used with Act 173, where you say, okay, here's what you're spending today. Here's where we think you'll be with your efficiencies. You'll basically get a increasing, because of what we're talking about, amount, more or less as a categorical grant going out that way. Do you have a thought on that methodology of getting out to that point?
That methodology is sound, right? It's a rational why is it sound, right? It's sound because it's cost-based, right? So you have a clear rationale. You've thought about what the transit, what are the things that have to happen? Where are the gains going to come? What are the dollars going to be? And you've mapped that back to a starting point. And you've thought about how that moves out. Second of all, it's predictable, right? If in fact you change the foundation formula and you throw a good dose of governance in there, the system's going to get really unstable. And I think you're starting to already sort of feel like, and one of the things that's really hard for kids to learn is in unstable systems.
Yes.
Right? I mean, we haven't talked anything much about kids, but let's put kids right there, right? Like it's really hard for teachers to teach well and for schools to, right? When things get unstable. And so being predictable and systematic and having a phased in approach that minimizes the amount of instability that you put into the system is what's good for kids too, right? How many years you phase it in? I think you have to map out what what the efficiencies are. We need to name the efficiencies, right? I think we put a whiteboard up there and we start naming, like we can start to name, like what are our assumptions about this, right? And some of those efficiencies will depend on what the smushing looks like, right? How mega are the districts or not, right? But we need to name the efficiencies, we need to cost them out, and then we need to figure out how we step into that over time, like what we did with 173. But then one of the things we probably could have done better with 173 is we probably could have checked in with districts more on the extent to which how the implementation was going and the extent to which those efficiencies were coming online, right? As quickly or at all, right? Because again, we don't want to end up in a spot where we march this out and we start decreasing our base, right? Without gaining those efficiencies, because what will happen is schools won't have the resources that we need. We'll introduce more instability in the system. We'll introduce more inequity in the system and we'll hurt kids. And that's not okay. So there is my recommendation. It's not okay to hurt kids.
I want to ask a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
So you've talked about the cost of efficiencies. I want to talk about the cost of the transition. When you say the cost of efficiencies, I actually think the cost of the transition, which I know is not what you mean.
Sure.
So there's how much you might save or how much more things might cost on the other end.
Yeah.
But over the 5 years, 10 years, however long the transition is, there are one-time or five-time costs of transition.
That's right.
The most obvious is physical infrastructure, right? Of the smushing, I believe you called it.
Smush.
I've also called it smushing.
Highly technical term.
Yeah. But I imagine there's also professional, with 173, there were massive professional
Yep.
development costs that we might not have factored in. And so how do you account for
You need a
those
balance
costs?
sheet, right? So we need to think about efficiencies as net, right? Costs and gains. It should be the net, because that net is what we need to sort of start deducting from our base, right?
Rather than having that come in sort of like as a separate.
It's gotta be net,
categorical
because,
expense.
well, any of those costs that we think are borne by school districts or schools, right? That would be part of the operating expenditures we would be thinking would be part of that base. Need to be accounted for. If in fact there is a separate lane of funding over here that's doing construction, right? that would not be part of the sort of the phased in approach with the base, because that's a separate lane of funding over here, unless that somehow affected the operating costs over here. One of the things that has to get disentangled if we do the smush is you already have districts who are paying debt service on capital and infrastructure, right? Like, these are things you have to disentangle as a part of this. And I mean, that was sort of one of the big issues with Act 46. You know, we've seen that even with some divorces recently, right? With school districts. But to your point, this phased in approach, right? Whatever that efficiency gain, we hope we're gaining, it's not costing more. So I'm
But
going.
we have no idea.
We have no idea. But that, I think that's my point, that we have no idea, right? And we need to identify what these things are. We need to put a dollar value to them, and we need to map it out over time. And we need to be systematic about it. We need to be transparent about it. And then we need to think about how that relates to the base. And then if we do this plan, we owe it to ourselves and the kids in the state to come back and make sure that that plan is going along as we think. Because otherwise we'll end up taking money off the table, potentially taking money off the table before the actual spending has gone down. Right? That's one of the things we have, like, and it's going to be a balancing act. And my guess is that it'll be recalibrated multiple times once the process starts. But you have to have a starting point. So that's a great question. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry I wasn't clear about that.
I would just add, I mean, what you're saying is the way to do it. And I think about, we're here for a short period of time, you know, where, I always ask, that's a great idea. Who's supposed to do that? Calculating the cost of efficiencies and putting a dollar value on these things is hard to say that we are able to do that. And I'm not sure how other states have handled that. Even though we're not supposed to compare ourselves to other states.
I think I just asked we don't compare the base and the weight stars, but the dollar amounts. But I think, and I mean, I have to go back and look. I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, the policy proposal that I've seen on the web suggests, you know, we might consolidate to these 5 districts. And that's a pretty massive consolidation. I don't know that in recent history we've had a state that has done that much consolidation at one time. So I'm not sure there's an analog. It raises questions about whether or not the goal is 5 over X number of years, and that there's some intermediate. Like, I don't know enough about the thinking that underlines that sort of that policy proposal, but those would be all questions that I think, from my perspective, are questions we need to ask and have answers to. As to who does the work, I don't know. But that's the work that's got to be done.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to both committee for coming.
Thank you for the
together and
opportunity to
spending this
contribute.
morning. Really hope folks can sort of take a few minutes, jot down the key questions that arose for you today, and we will be all diving into it.
And my email address is on the presentation. Feel free to email. I'm happy to answer questions. And if I can, I can direct you to somebody who might be able to. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ways and Means Committee is back in the Ways and Means Committee room at 1:15.